Hi, boys and girls. So for today's activity, we are going to be listening to a read aloud. And then what you're going to do is you're going to write a summary of the story. So I want to see how good our listening skills are, paying attention to details, and then being able to retell the story. This is for if you are unable to come to the live reading in our Google Hangout. So you can watch this and then you can go ahead and work on your summary. So we are going to be reading The Giant Hug. All right. The Giant Hug. What do you want to send Granny for her birthday? Owen's mother asked. A giant hug, Owen replied. He opened his arms wide as he could, to show how giant the hug would be. Do you want to draw a picture of you hugging Granny? His mother asked. No, Owen said. I want to send a real hug. I'll give the mailman a hug and ask him to send it to Granny. They gathered their letters and walked to the post office in town. Soon they got to the front of the line, and Mr. Nevin called out, Next! I want to mail a hug to my Granny. Will you please send it? Owen asked in the most polite voice. Well, we don't normally send hugs, but I suppose we can give it a try, Mr. Nevin said. Owen's mother wrote down Granny's address for Mr. Nevin. Owen walked behind the counter, opened his arms as wide as he possibly could, and gave Mr. Nevin a giant hug. Please make the hug just as giant when you pass it to the mailman, Owen said. Oh, I won't see the mailman who delivers it to your Granny. I give the mail to Mr. Porter, who sorts it and puts it onto a truck in the big city. After that, it's put on a plane and flown across the country, Mr. Nevin said. Well, will you give a hug to Mr. Porter, then, Owen said, as Mr. Nevin carried the mail to Miss Porter. Mr. Nevin looked down awkwardly at Mrs. Porter as he handed her the mail and addressed of Owen's Granny. He blushed and mumbled, and, here's a hug. Mr. Nevin opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Mrs. Porter a giant hug. Mrs. Porter smiled as she sorted the mail. Just then the deliverer came to collect the mail bound for the big city. As the deliverer lifted the last heavy bag of mail, Mrs. Porter said, Leroy, one more thing. Someone is sending a hug to his Granny. Here is the address, and here is the hug. Mrs. Porter opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Leroy a giant hug. Leroy laughed and said, Now that's a piece of mail you don't see often. Leroy whistled on the way to the big city. After unloading the mail, he checked the schedule to see who was driving the mail to the airport. It read James. Leroy found James in the break room, eating a morning snack. Hi, James. I know this seems a little odd, but a hug is being sent through the mail to someone's Granny. And this is her address, said Leroy. Leroy opened his arms wide as he possibly could and gave James a giant hug. James cringed. He was not the hugging type, but he would do his job. Later that afternoon, James arrived at the airport. He asked the mail handler when the mail was being loaded onto the plane. The mail was taken to the plane a few minutes ago, the mail handler said. James rushed to the plane where Captain Johnson was getting ready to board. Captain, a kid is sending a hug through the mail to his Granny. Here's the address, and here's the hug, James said with a grimace. James opened his arms as wide as he could and gave the Captain Johnson a giant hug. "Now, isn't that a grand way to start the day?" Captain Johnson bellowed. When the plane landed, Captain Johnson walked to the airport office. He saw Amanda standing next to the mail truck, looking sad. "Hello, are you driving the truck to the city?" Captain Johnson asked. Amanda nodded glumly. "A hug is being sent through the mail," Captain Johnson announced. Captain Johnson opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Amanda a giant hug. Amanda brightened and said, "Thank you." She bobbed her head to the music as she drove around unloading mail. Amanda went from Chad, the driver, taking the mail to Granny's town. "Chad, a hug is being sent through the mail. Here's the address, and well, there's a hug," Amanda said as her face turned red. Amanda opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Chad a giant hug. Chad chuckled and said finally, "Do you want to go dancing tonight?" "I'd love to go," Amanda exclaimed. Chad kicked up his heels and hopped into his truck. Early the next morning, Chad drove to Granny's town. As he prepared to return to the city, he remembered the hug. "Who will be delivering the mail to Penside today?" Chad asked the supervisor. "Shelley, but she's not here yet," Miss Greenberg replied as she adjusted her glasses. "Please pass this along to her," Chad said. Chad opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Miss Greenberg a giant hug. Mrs. Greenberg gasped with surprise as her glasses lifted to the side. "Shelley, I need a word with you," Miss Greenberg called when Shelley arrived. "A hug is being sent through the mail to a boy's granny, and you are the mail woman delivering it," Miss Greenberg said. Miss Greenberg opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Shelley a giant hug. "Granny will be delighted," Shelley exclaimed. Shelley stopped to smell the flowers as she delivered the mail from door to door. She saw Granny gardening in the yard. "Miss Lewis, I have a special delivery for you," Shelley said. "Your grandson sent you a hug." Shelley opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Granny a giant hug. Granny grinned and said, "That's the most wonderful piece of mail I've ever received. You send that grandson of mine a big kiss." Granny puckered up her lips and gave Shelley a big wet kiss on the cheek. The end. So what you're going to do now is you're going to write a summary of what we just read. So you're going to use your summary chart and go ahead and tell me all the important parts of our story and how it ended.